And one other project I've gotten to work on that I'll share with you as well is a Atlas of Emotion. And this was a project I collaborated on with my father, who's an emotion scientist named Paul Ekman, and a design company here based in San Francisco. This was a project that the Dalai Lama asked for us to create in order to have an atlas or map of our emotions. Having an atlas or map provides a language, some way to describe and understand what's happening to us so we can avoid succumbing to feelings of rumination and overwhelm and have a calm mind in which we can choose more clearly how we'd like to respond. This also relates to cultivating emotional balance, a training I've been leading for the last 10 years in which we bring the best from Western psychology and Eastern contemplative science specifically on managing destructive emotions. So I'm really looking forward to sharing with you a bit from my history and background in all these practices, especially into healthcare. So I'm going to go ahead and get started by talking with you about burnout. Now, of course, you all know the term burnout, but some of you may not know the specifics of what burnout actually measures. So Christina Maslach, who I was fortunate to have on my dissertation committee, designed the burnout scale in the 70s. And the way she did so was not by thinking what makes people stressed out. What she did was interview hundreds of people, and not about acute stress, like what is it like to have a hard day, but what is it like to have chronic, ongoing stress? Every day, that drain, that feeling of overwhelm. And when she looked at these interviews, what she found was that there was three main domains of this kind of burnout-related stress. The first domain is called emotional exhaustion. This really describes that feeling at the end of the day where you have been seeing patients and in some ways not able to express how you really feel. You're doing what's called an emotion labor. You're over-amplifying the good, I'm really happy, everything's great, and you're suppressing in a lot of ways what's hard, your feelings of fear and anxiety, sadness, wondering if you can actually help these people. So this end of the day feeling of having practiced a lot of emotional labor can be quite exhausting. And when you look at the majority of studies that are reporting on burnout in healthcare, they're reporting on that emotional exhaustion. The exhaustion itself can be pretty well addressed by having time to take care of ourselves. I know that at this point in the healthcare world, especially in the training world, self-care can be considered a bit of almost a four-letter word. People are really tired of hearing how they need to take the responsibility to help or change themselves instead of the entire healthcare institution doing what's needed and required to give people more time to recover and to recuperate. So as I say, it's important to have this time. I'm aware it can be really difficult to access it. So we have emotional exhaustion as this first level of burnout. The second level of burnout is what's called a lack of efficacy. And it really impedes our sense of meaning. This lack of efficacy means I can't get done what's expected of me. On a day-to-day basis, there is more to do than I can respond to. And there's more than I can do and respond to effectively. A lot of people feel this lack of efficacy around electronic medical records. I just can't keep up. And as a result, I'm not able to spend the time with my patients that I'd like. It's a different quality than being emotionally exhausted. This is one that is a little bit more of an overwhelm. We can have emotional exhaustion even when we feel pretty good. Like, wow, today was exhausting, but I really connected and it made a difference. So there's an interesting different level here, and one that makes it hard for us to feel like what we do makes a difference. Now, this third level of burnout is one that's called depersonalization or cynicism. This is when we reach the level at our work where we are not exhausted, we are not feeling lack of efficacy, we are just numb. We kind of don't care. It's just too much to tolerate the difficulty of every day, and we've just kind of put up our guard and in some ways are at a sub-stimulation level of stress. We are just checked out. And this level of cynicism, for anyone who's worked on a team, you know, it is impossible to move anything forward if even one person has this attitude. They'll be shooting down any new ideas, they aren't willing to do the work. And so this level of cynicism and depersonalization is really concerning. And it has different ways that it needs to be approached. When we think about the amount of research on burnout, there's profound amount of research, decades of research. And yet we're just beginning to understand what helps us address each of these levels. And I invite you as a healthcare provider to really investigate if you have noticed these kinds of burnout in your own experience, in your own practice. Is there different strategies or solutions that work? With depersonalization, my assumption and what I know from the literature to date is that we need to feel some sense of purpose and efficacy. I mean, we feel the depersonalization and cynicism because we can't help. So how do we get a feeling of being able to do something? And when we have that lack of efficacy and purpose, the same is true. Can we actually set our intention, as we did in the beginning, towards something more easy, something more simple? Today I want to show up and be a little more open. Or today I want to show up and really pay attention to what's happening in my body. So to set these smaller intentions or goals we can fulfill. This can be a way of really regaining that sense of capacity, of ability. So here's a little on burnout. And now I really want to connect this to empathy. And I am sharing a bit from a series of articles I've written, most recently with Michael Krasner or Mick Krasner, who runs the Mindful Practice program out of the University of Rochester. And we wrote a piece together considering how do we include empathy and the neuroscience of empathy into medical education in a meaningful way. So I want us to start with a simple definition of empathy. And in this case, I'm going to call it a professional empathy. So not necessarily what you're feeling with your family members or your friends, but as a care provider, as someone who on an everyday basis, part of your treatment requires connecting to another person, understanding what they need, and responding. So the empathy I'm describing here is drawn from neuroscientific literature, and it has two main components. The two components include first, meaning what happens first, is an automatic affective emotional resonance. So I'll use an example. If I'm a social worker in the ER and I see a patient come in to talk with me and I see her tearful and she's crying and is clearly upset, at an almost automatic level, I am resonating to her emotional experience because of my mirror neurons, because of my physiological hardwiring head to toe to connect to and notice what's happening to others. I'm able to assess and feel with. It doesn't mean I'm having the exact same experience as her. It means that I can resonate to her emotions, her tears. So this is our first level of affective empathy. Then there is what's called cognitive appraisal, a curiosity. There's almost immediately after that emotional resonance, there's then a wondering, what's going on with this person? Why is she tearful? So those two components are empathy. There's the emotional resonance and the curiosity, the appraisal, the perspective taking. Now, this empathy can actually lead to a variety of different outcomes. And I want to walk us through three and have you reflect on if this resonates to you. We have the first kind of empathy where, for example, this woman comes in tearful to my office. I have an appraisal. What's going on with her? And in this example, I'm thinking of someone who I'd seen before. And I'd seen her before come into the ER as a result of domestic violence. And so in my appraisal, I'm wondering, wow, I wonder what's going on with her partnership. I wonder if she's safe. And so my response, after my resonance and my appraisal is, how can I be helpful to her? What is the empathic response? What is the compassionate response? When we respond compassionately with this empathic response, this doesn't necessarily mean that we are doing anything. It doesn't mean that we are trying to fix the entire situation. It could mean that we're listening with compassion. We're paying attention to what the person in front of us is telling us they need. One of the ways that empathy can lead to burnout is when we feel that everything we're being presented with is something we have to fix or do. And unfortunately, a good deal of medical education across different fields gives us this idea that we're going to train you really well, and then you're going to be able to fix and solve everything if you just work at it. And that sets us up in some ways to burn out. There's a way in which we obviously can't help everyone and everything. We can't solve poverty through our practice of medicine. We can't solve inequality through our practice of medicine. We can't solve a healthcare system through our practice of medicine. And one of the ways that we can listen compassionately is by really having and working on a belief that my compassionate listening is doing. When we believe there's something we can do, we can avoid feelings of helplessness, like I'm not making a difference. The emotional exhaustion doesn't feel as draining if we feel like what we do makes a difference. So here's one way of empathy. I see this woman and her tears. I recognize and understand what's going on for her, and I show up as she needs me. This may not be an embrace. That may not be culturally appropriate. It might not be appropriate for our relationship. It may mean that I'm giving her referrals to different domestic violence shelters or counseling. It may mean that I'm giving her some idea about boundaries and directions. But I'm really listening to what she needs. That's the compassionate response to empathy. Now, I want to give you two other examples. I could have this woman come in, see her tears, and in my appraisal, instead of it being one of, I wonder what's happening to her, I'm curious, my appraisal is one that ends up being more along the lines of distancing and in some ways a kind of negativity. And I see her come in and I think, I know why she's here. She still hasn't left him. Last time she was here, I already gave her the referrals. She knows it's not safe. They have kids. Why is she doing this? You know what? If she really wanted help, she would do this for herself. I'm not going to work for her because she's not working for herself. Now, I'm being exaggerated here, but I think all of us can recognize this experience where our appraisal of the situation actually creates kind of aversion or blaming. And this is a lot like that cynicism level of burnout, where we just are disengaged and don't in some ways care. I wish this didn't happen, and yet, especially during my time in the ER, we have so many cases where people are coming frequently for the same problem. And it really, really challenges our empathy to keep our curiosity open of what's happening with them now. How can I empathically respond to their suffering? Yeah, maybe they aren't working hard for their own well-being. And yet because my goal is just staying compassionate, I will still work for them. So I think some people get a little caught up with compassion where there's a belief that I will be compassionate if someone is also showing up for themselves. Like I will help if they are willing to receive the help. And I get that. But as a professional, we have to help irrespective of whether or not someone's going to take it. And what I mean by that is we are trying always for their own well-being, even if they're not trying that hard. And the mindset here isn't that the more that we compassion to them, the better they'll get. The idea is, how do we continue to have a compassionate heart? How do we sustain it? How do we not succumb to those feelings of aversion and distancing? So I want you to, consider a time when there may have been this instance and consider what were the conditions that might have led to that, of that feeling of distancing. We're going to move on now to one other form of empathy or way that empathy can unfold. Here I have this woman come in, again, tearful. Again, I know a bit of her history. And my immediate response is of cognitive appraisal is, I can't handle this. So I had one other mentor on my dissertation committee who truly changed my life and thinking, Jody Halpern. And she wrote about this idea that when we kind of self-reference in our experience of empathy, it leads to overwhelm. We get kind of merged with this patient. We don't see the critical and important distance between what's happening to them and what's happening to us. And instead, we kind of succumb to overwhelm and despair. And of course, not only is that hard for us, it actually makes us unavailable for compassion. Though that heartfelt feeling of sadness and despair is beautiful, right? We're resonating to the sadness of domestic violence and ongoing cycles and whatever other challenges you're responding to. And we also are unavailable or we're lost in our own difficulty. So we see here how empathy indeed can have some challenges. And what I'm really trying to emphasize here is the importance of how we move towards compassion. And I want to give us a basic schema and then talk a little bit more about moving towards compassion or the skills of compassion, which, spoiler alert, are not about practicing everyday compassion. That is enormously important, but I think you already know that. I want to tell you more about practicing emotional awareness and how emotional awareness facilitates compassion. So at a very simple level,